The winter wind cut through Zora Williams's thin jacket like it wasn't even there. She pulled it tighter around her shoulders and quickened her pace, her work boots crunching through the thin layer of ice that had formed over puddles on the cracked sidewalk. Chicago in January was no joke. The sky hung dark and heavy above her at just 6 in the evening, and her fingers had gone numb 15 minutes into her walk home. Zora had just finished her morning shift at Dot's Diner and had exactly 2 hours before she needed to clock in at Prestige Office Towers for her night cleaning job. Just enough time to go home, maybe take a 20-minute nap and change uniforms. She calculated the dollars she'd made in tips today. $16.35. Not great, but not terrible either. Combined with her hourly wage, today would put her about 1/8 of the way toward this month's rent. At 19, Zora was doing what everyone told her was impossible. 6 months ago, she'd aged out of her final foster home, and her caseworker had given her that look, the one that said she'd likely end up another statistic. But Zora had been saving since she was 16, working weekend jobs and summers, hiding cash in a sock taped to the underside of various foster home dressers. Enough for first and last month's rent on the smallest apartment she could find. Her building came into view several blocks ahead, but between her and home stretched an abandoned lot filled with discarded furniture, old tires, and piles of garbage. Most people walked the long way around, adding 15 minutes to their commute. Zora didn't have 15 minutes to spare. She took a deep breath and turned into the lot, following the narrow path that others before her had trampled through the debris. The temperature seemed to drop another 5 degrees as she entered the shadowy space between piles of trash. Broken glass crunched underfoot. The smell was worse in winter somehow, sharper without summer heat to make it heavy. Old food, motor oil, something dead in the corner that she didn't want to investigate. 2 more minutes and you're home, Zora whispered to herself, her breath forming little clouds in the freezing air. Hot shower. Kuppelframa. 20 minutes with your eyes closed. That's when she heard it. So faint she almost convinced herself it was just the wind whistling through the metal frames of abandoned appliances. But then it came again. A tiny mewling sound like a kitten, but not quite. Zora stopped walking. Hello? She called out, feeling foolish immediately. Whatever made that sound wasn't going to answer her. The cry came again, definitely to her right, behind a stack of flattened cardboard boxes and what looked like half of an old couch. Zora hesitated. She was already cutting it close on time. But something pulled her toward the sound. Curiosity, maybe, or something deeper she couldn't name. She pushed aside a soggy cardboard box and gasped. Nestled in what looked like a hastily made nest of newspaper and a thin, dirty blanket, lay a tiny baby, its face scrunched up and red from crying. The infant couldn't have been more than a few days old. Oh my God, Zora breathed, dropping to her knees in the filthy snow. Oh my God! The baby's cries grew softer, almost as if it was too tired to continue. Its little hands had pushed free of the blanket and were exposed to the freezing air, the skin taking on a bluish tint that made Zora's heart race with panic. Without hesitation, she shrugged off her jacket, her only jacket, and gently wrapped it around the baby, making sure to cover the exposed hands and feet. The infant was so small it nearly disappeared inside the fabric. It's okay, she whispered, though her voice shook. I've got you now. Zora looked around desperately as if help might materialize among the trash piles. Her phone was 5 years old and barely functional, with no data plan, but it could still make calls. With trembling fingers, she dialed 911. Emergency services, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's voice was calm, almost bored. I found a baby, Zora said, her words tumbling out. In the empty lot on 47th and Karlov. It's freezing out here and the baby's so small. I don't think it's been here long, but it's cold, really cold. Is the baby breathing? The dispatcher's tone changed instantly. Zora looked down. The infant's chest rose and fell in shallow movements. Yes, breathing, but not crying anymore. That's bad, right? It was crying before. An ambulance is on the way. Can you safely move to the street where they can see you? Yes, Zora said, carefully gathering the jacket-wrapped bundle in her arms. The baby was lighter than she expected, like holding a small loaf of bread. I'm heading there now. As she navigated back through the trash, holding the baby close to her chest, Zora felt something shift inside her, a fierce protectiveness she'd never experienced before. She'd spent her whole life being unwanted, shuttled from one foster home to another, always the extra mouth to feed, the additional burden, but this tiny human in her arms was even more vulnerable, even more alone. "Don't worry," she whispered, her lips close to the baby's forehead. "I found you. You're not alone anymore." The baby's eyes fluttered open briefly, dark eyes unfocused but somehow looking right at her. Zora felt tears spring to her own eyes. By the time she reached the sidewalk, her uniform shirt was soaked through with melted snow and sweat despite the cold. She bounced gently on the balls of her feet, trying to keep the baby warm with movement, scanning the street for flashing lights. Her night job would have to wait. For the first time in months, something mattered more than making rent. The ambulance arrived in a wail of sirens that startled the baby awake. It began to cry again, a sound that relieved Zora more than anything. Crying meant fighting. Fighting meant living. The paramedics jumped out, moving with practiced efficiency. A woman with tight gray curls reached for the baby. "I'm Wilson," she said briskly. "You found this child?" "Yes," Zora said, reluctantly transferring the bundle to the paramedic's arms. "In there behind some cardboard. I don't know how long it was there." Wilson unwrapped the jacket just enough to check the baby quickly. "It's a girl," she said. "Newborn, I'd say. Umbilical cord was cut, but not professionally." She glanced up at Zora with narrowed eyes. "This isn't your baby?" "No." Zora stepped back, shocked at the implication. "No, I was walking home from work. I heard crying. The male paramedic appeared with a special warming blanket and they transferred the baby into it. Core temperature is low but not critical," he reported. "We need to get her to Chicago Children's right away." Zora stood shivering on the sidewalk, suddenly aware that she'd given away her only jacket. The female paramedic seemed to notice at the same time. "You coming with us?" Wilson asked, her tone softer now. "You look half frozen yourself and the police will want a statement." Zora hesitated. Her night job. The rent money. The warning her supervisor had given last week about being late again. The baby gave another small cry from inside the ambulance. "Yes," Zora said. "I'm coming." The ride to the hospital passed in a blur. Zora sat pressed against the side of the ambulance, out of the way, watching as the paramedics worked on the tiny girl. They inserted an IV into a vein so small Zora could barely see it. They checked vitals, murmuring medical terms to each other that Zora didn't understand. The baby cried sometimes and was silent at others, her little face visible within the cocoon of warming blankets and monitoring wires. At the hospital, everything accelerated. The baby was whisked away on a rolling incubator, surrounded by a team of doctors speaking rapidly. Zora tried to follow but was intercepted by a nurse who guided her to a waiting room and handed her a clipboard of forms. "I don't know anything about the baby," Zora explained. "I just found her." "Just fill out what you can, hun," the nurse said kindly. "Someone will be with you shortly." Zora stared at the form. Name of patient unknown. Date of birth unknown. Medical history unknown. Parents unknown. Insurance none. A wave of sadness washed over her. This tiny human had entered the world with nothing and no one, not even a name. Zora knew that feeling too well. A police officer arrived to take her statement. Then a hospital social worker. Then another official from Child Protective Services. Zora repeated her story again and again, watching the clock tick past the start time of her evening job. She could picture her supervisor's face, hear the speech about reliability and responsibility. The job she desperately needed slipping away with each passing minute. But each time she thought about leaving, she remembered those tiny fingers, blue with cold. The silent lot where the baby might never have been found if Zora hadn't taken her shortcut home. 4 hours after arriving at the hospital, a doctor finally approached her. He was young with dark circles under his eyes, but his smile was kind. "The baby you found is doing well," he said. "Her temperature is back to normal. She's slightly undernourished, but otherwise healthy. It's quite miraculous considering the circumstances." Relief flooded through Zora. "Can I see her?" The doctor hesitated. "Normally we only allow family, but given the situation..." He gestured for Zora to follow him. The neonatal unit was quiet and dimly lit. Machines beeped softly beside incubators containing impossibly small babies. The doctor led her to one in the corner where the baby girl lay sleeping, free of most of the wires and tubes from earlier. Her skin was a warm brown, several shades lighter than Zora's own deep complexion. In the hospital-issued cap and gown, wrapped in a clean blanket, she looked like any other newborn. Perfect, complete, meant to be here. She's a fighter, the doctor said quietly. Another hour out there in this weather. He didn't finish the thought. Zora placed her hand gently on the side of the incubator. What happens to her now? Child Services will place her in emergency foster care while they search for the parents. If they can't be found, or if there are— He paused, choosing his words carefully. Issues with their fitness as parents, she'll likely be placed for adoption. Foster care, the system that had raised Zora, passed her around like an unwanted gift, finally spitting her out at 18 with nothing but a trash bag of clothes and a certificate of high school completion. The thought of this tiny, perfect baby entering that same system made Zora's chest tighten. Could I— Zora started, then stopped, surprised by the words forming in her own mind. Is there any way I could be with her? Just until they find her family? The doctor looked at her with surprise. That would be up to Child Services, but it's unusual for a non-relative, especially someone so young. Zora supplied. Poor? I know I don't look like much, but I've got an apartment. 2 jobs, one of which she'd probably just lost. I found her. I feel responsible. The doctor's expression softened. I'll mention it to the social worker, but don't get your hopes up. Zora nodded, her eyes drawn back to the sleeping baby. Against all logic, against her own careful plans for survival, she felt connected to this abandoned child. Maybe because nobody had ever fought for Zora herself, had ever looked at her and decided she was worth sacrificing for. Sleep tight, little one, she whispered against the plastic of the incubator. I'll be back tomorrow. And somehow, despite the uncertainty swirling around them both, Zora knew she would keep that promise. Zora's alarm blared at 5 a.m., jolting her awake on the lumpy couch she'd fallen asleep on fully dressed. For a moment, she stared at the water stains on her ceiling, trying to remember why she felt so strange. Then it all came rushing back, the baby in the trash heap, the ambulance, the hospital. She'd finally returned home at 1:30 a.m. after promising the nurses she'd come back in the morning. Her night cleaning job was almost certainly gone. Her phone showed 3 missed calls from her supervisor, each voicemail more irritated than the last. Zora dragged herself to the shower, letting the lukewarm water wash away yesterday's grime while her mind raced. Without that second job, making rent would be impossible. She'd have to find something new fast. But first she had to get to the hospital. Something about that tiny baby pulled at her heart in ways she couldn't explain. Dot's diner was on the way to the hospital. Zora stopped in, bracing herself for her manager's reaction to her rumpled uniform and exhausted face. Where's your jacket? Wanda asked the moment Zora stepped inside. The older woman had owned the diner for 30 years and ran it with military precision. It's a long story, Zora said, tying her apron with trembling fingers. I'm sorry about the uniform. There was an emergency. To her surprise, Wanda's face softened. You look half dead, girl. What happened? The words tumbled out of Zora, finding the baby, the hospital, staying until the social worker arrived. Wanda listened, eyes widening. Lord have mercy, she whispered when Zora finished. That poor little thing, and you gave her your only coat? Zora nodded, embarrassed by the sudden tears in her eyes. I lost my night job over it. They fired me this morning. Wanda's mouth said in a hard line. Well, you can pick up extra shifts here until you find something else. And take this. She pulled a thick cardigan from under the counter. It's not much, but it'll keep you warmer than nothing. Thank you, Zora whispered, touched by the unexpected kindness. Now get to work. Morning rush is starting. The breakfast crowd kept Zora too busy to think, her body moving on autopilot as she filled coffee cups and delivered plates of eggs and pancakes. By noon, her tips jar held almost $30, a rare windfall. When her shift ended at 2 p.m., she counted out exact bus fare and headed straight to the hospital. The same social worker from yesterday, Ms. Powell, was waiting in the lobby. Her neat gray suit and clipboard radiated official authority that made Zora conscious of her diner uniform and borrowed cardigan. I'm glad you came back, Ms. Powell said, leading Zora through the maze of hospital corridors. Most people who find abandoned babies don't. Is she okay? Zora asked. She's doing well. The doctors say she can be released tomorrow. Ms. Powell stopped walking and turned to face Zora directly. Which brings me to the reason I wanted to meet with you. We need to discuss placement. Zora's heart sank. Here it comes, she thought. The baby would disappear into the foster care system, just another statistic. Normally, we'd place her in one of our emergency foster homes while we search for the parents, Ms. Powell continued. But those homes are all at capacity right now. What does that mean for the baby? Zora asked. It means she might have to stay in the hospital longer than necessary or be placed in a group home setting, which isn't ideal for an infant. Ms. Powell studied Zora's face carefully. Unless we can find another option. Zora felt a strange tightening in her chest. Like what? The doctor mentioned you expressed interest in caring for her temporarily. I did, but I didn't think, I'm only 19. I live alone. I just lost one of my jobs. Ms. Powell nodded. All valid concerns, but you have stable housing, you're employed, you have no criminal record, and most importantly, you've already shown extraordinary care for this child. Zora stared at her, unable to process what she was hearing. You're asking me to take the baby? I'm asking if you'd consider becoming an emergency foster placement for her. It would be temporary, just until we locate her family or find a permanent placement. You'd receive a small stipend to cover basic needs. Zora's mind raced. Her tiny studio apartment barely fit her single bed and hot plate. She worked long hours. She knew nothing about babies. But then she remembered the feeling of those tiny fingers wrapped around her own in the ambulance. The peaceful look on the baby's face when she'd finally fallen asleep in the hospital, safe and warm. Can I see her? Zora asked. The nursery was quieter today. A different nurse led them to the same incubator, where the baby lay awake, dark eyes blinking at the ceiling. She looked stronger already, her skin a healthier color, her tiny body moving more vigorously under the hospital blanket. Hey there, Zora whispered, and to her amazement the baby's eyes seemed to find hers. Something powerful and unnamed passed between them. Could I hold her? Zora asked the nurse. Of course. Sit in that rocker. The nurse lifted the baby with practiced hands, showing Zora how to support the head as she placed her in Zora's arms. The weight of her, so slight yet so significant, made Zora's breath catch. What's her name? Zora asked, realizing the baby had been baby dough on all the hospital paperwork. Ms. Powell looked up from her clipboard. She doesn't have one yet. If you become her foster parent, you could give her a temporary name. Zora studied the tiny face looking up at her. Despite everything, being abandoned, left to freeze, handled by strangers, there was something undefeated in those dark eyes. Hope, Zora said softly. Her name is Hope. The word hung in the air between them, seeming to settle something in Zora's mind. Before she could second-guess herself, she looked up at Ms. Powell. I'll do it. I'll take her home. The next 24 hours passed in a whirlwind. Ms. Powell fast-tracked the emergency approval process, conducting a hurried home inspection of Zora's apartment. She frowned at the small space but nodded approvingly at its cleanliness. You'll need a crib, diapers, formula, she said, making notes. The stipend won't come through for at least a week. Zora swallowed hard. The money she'd saved for rent would have to be used for baby supplies instead. She'd figure out the rest somehow. I know someone who might have a bassinet, she said, thinking of Mrs. Chen down the hall, whose grandchildren sometimes visited. After Miss Powell left, Zora sat on her bed, reality crashing down around her. What was she doing? How could she possibly care for a baby? She buried her face in her hands, fighting the urge to call Miss Powell and back out. Then her phone rang. Wanda from the diner. Just checking if you're coming in tomorrow. Her boss said, I don't know, Zora admitted. Something's happened. She explained about becoming Hope's emergency foster parent. There was a long silence on the other end. Then Wanda said, My daughter outgrew her baby things years ago. They're in my storage unit. Come by the diner after closing and we'll see what you can use. That evening, Zora walked home with a second-hand bassinet, 3 bags of baby clothes, a box of diapers, and 2 cans of formula, all gifts from Wanda and 2 regular customers who'd overheard their conversation. The generosity left Zora speechless, unused to people helping her without expecting anything in return. Mrs. Chen from down the hall appeared as Zora struggled to get everything through the building's front door. New baby? The elderly woman asked, holding the door open. Sort of, Zora said, explaining the situation as they climbed the stairs together. Mrs. Chen nodded thoughtfully. Brave girl. I watch baby sometimes when you work, yes? I raised 5 children. I know babies. Zora blinked back tears for what felt like the 100th time that day. That would help so much. Thank you. By the time Zora picked up Hope from the hospital the next morning, her tiny apartment had been transformed. The bassinet sat beside her bed filled with clean blankets. Diapers and wipes were stacked on her dresser. A neighbor's son had rigged a small shelving unit to hold bottles and formula. Dr. Patel, the same young doctor from the first night, handed Hope to Zora with a smile. She's gained 6 ounces already. A real fighter. Just like someone else I know. Ms. Powell added, giving Zora an encouraging nod as she handed over a folder of paperwork, emergency numbers, and instructions. I'll check in on Wednesday. Call any time if you need help. Zora nodded, suddenly terrified as the reality set in. She was taking home a baby. A human life was in her hands. The bus ride home was nerve-wracking. Every bump in the road made Zora tighten her grip on Hope, who slept peacefully against her chest in a baby carrier Wanda had found. People smiled at them, an elderly woman offering Zora a seat, a teenager giving up his spot next to her so she could put down the diaper bag. Inside her apartment, Zora stood in the center of the room. Hope still asleep against her and took a deep breath. Well, it's just us now, she whispered. As if in response, Hope's eyes fluttered open. She didn't cry, just gazed up at Zora with that same undefeated look. I don't really know what I'm doing, Zora confessed to the baby, but I'm going to try my best. I promise. Hope's tiny hand escaped the blanket and wrapped around Zora's finger. The grip was surprisingly strong, as if sealing their pact. That first night was the hardest. Hope woke every 2 hours, hungry or needing a change or just wanting to be held. Zora followed the hospital's instructions meticulously, terrified of making a mistake. By morning, her eyes burned with exhaustion, but there was also a strange new feeling blooming in her chest, a sense of purpose she'd never known before. Wanda had given her 3 days off to settle in, but money was already tight. On the 4th day, Zora bundled Hope up and took her to the diner, praying the baby would sleep through her shift. Bring her to the back, Wanda said, leading Zora to a small office behind the kitchen. She'd set up a portable crib next to her desk. She can stay here while you work. I'll keep an eye on her. Zora stared at her boss in disbelief. You'd do that? Wanda shrugged, but her eyes were kind. My mama did the same for me when my kids were small. Sometimes we all need a little help. That day, something shifted in Zora's world. Customers who'd barely noticed her before stopped to coo at Hope during Zora's breaks. A businessman left an extra $20 with his usual $5 tip, winking as he said, "For the little one's college fund." The cook brought in a baby swing his grandkids had outgrown. For the first time since she'd aged out of foster care, Zora felt like she wasn't completely alone. Hope, this tiny person who had nothing and no one, had somehow given Zora the one thing she'd never had, a community. People who saw her and wanted to help. As Zora rocked Hope to sleep that night in their tiny apartment, she whispered, "Maybe we saved each other." Hope's only answer was a sleepy sigh as she nestled closer to Zora's heart. 3 months passed in a blur of sleepless nights. Diaper changes and a new routine that somehow worked despite all odds. Zora had adapted to motherhood with a determination that surprised even herself. Her tiny apartment now featured a proper crib, donated by one of the diner's regular customers, and a small bookshelf filled with second-hand baby books. Pictures of Hope's milestones covered her refrigerator. First real smile, first time sleeping through the night, first time rolling over. Ms. Powell visited every 2 weeks, her initial skepticism gradually softening as she saw how Zora had risen to the challenge. During her last visit, she'd even smiled when Hope reached for Zora instead of her. "You've done an exceptional job," Ms. Powell admitted, reviewing her notes. "Hope is thriving. Her growth and development are right on track." "Any word on her family?" Zora asked, trying to keep her voice neutral despite the knot of dread that formed in her stomach whenever the subject arose. She knew this arrangement was temporary, but with each passing day, the thought of giving Hope up became more painful. Ms. Powell shook her head. "Nothing yet. The police investigation is still open, but they haven't found any leads. No one has come forward to claim her." Zora nodded, feeling guilty about the relief that washed over her. "I should warn you," Ms. Powell continued, more gently than usual, "that at the 6-month mark, we'll need to start discussing more permanent placement options if her biological family isn't found." "What does that mean exactly?" Zora asked, her arms tightening instinctively around Hope. "It means she would likely be placed for adoption with a pre-approved family." Seeing Zora's expression, She added, "You could apply to adopt her yourself. But I should be honest. Single parents under 25 with your income level rarely get approved." The words hung in the air like a thundercloud. Zora forced herself to nod, to act like a professional foster parent rather than a woman whose heart was breaking. After Ms. Powell left, Zora sat on the floor with Hope, watching as the baby grabbed at colorful blocks with growing coordination. Hope had brought an unexpected brightness into Zora's world, and the thought of losing her was almost unbearable. "We'll figure something out," she whispered, more to herself than to Hope. The next morning at the diner, Zora was filling salt shakers when Wanda called her to the counter. A woman in a neat blazer sat at the end, nursing a coffee and reading a newspaper. "This is Professor Rivera from Chicago Community College," Wanda said. "She wants to talk to you." Zora wiped her hands nervously on her apron. "Me, why?" Professor Rivera extended her hand. "I'm the director of the Bridge to Success Scholarship Program. Wanda has been telling me about you for weeks, and I'm interested in learning more." "Scholarship?" Zora looked between the professor and Wanda in confusion. "For non-traditional students," Professor Rivera explained. "People who've overcome significant obstacles to pursue higher education. The program covers tuition and provides a small living stipend." Zora's mind raced. College had always seemed like an impossible dream. Between aging out of foster care and working to survive, there had never been time or money to even consider it. "I don't understand," Zora said. "I haven't applied for any scholarships." Wanda gave her a gentle nudge. "That's why she's here, girl. To see if you want to apply." "I told her how smart you are, how good you are with numbers, how you're raising that baby on your own." Professor Rivera smiled. "The spring semester starts in 6 weeks. We have 3 spots left. Why don't we discuss what fields might interest you?" By the time her shift ended, Zora had tentative plans to apply for the scholarship and start classes in accounting, a field she'd always had a knack for, balancing her meager finances down to the penny. Professor Rivera had even mentioned childcare assistance as part of the program. As Zora walked home, Hope sleeping peacefully in her carrier, the future suddenly seemed to hold possibilities beyond just surviving month to month. Education could mean a better job, more security, a chance to provide Hope with opportunities Zora had never had herself. But first, she had to get through tonight's dinner rush. Wanda had promoted Zora to evening shift supervisor, with slightly better pay and more consistent hours. The additional income had been a blessing, allowing Zora to buy a second-hand laptop where she researched infant development and began to explore online college courses. Mrs. Chen was waiting at Zora's apartment to take over baby duties, her wrinkled face lighting up at the sight of Hope. The elderly woman had become an unexpected ally, watching Hope 3 evenings a week and teaching Zora traditional Chinese lullabies that seemed to soothe the baby instantly. "She eat good today?" Mrs. Chen asked, reaching for Hope with practiced hands. "Very good," Zora confirmed, transferring the sleeping baby and running through the evening routine. "There's expressed milk in the fridge. She should sleep another hour at least." Mrs. Chen nodded confidently. "You go work. We fine here." Across town in a penthouse overlooking the lake, Philip Kingsley hung up the phone and turned to his wife Catherine with a weary sigh. Another dead end. Catherine barely seemed to hear him. She sat by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the city as if searching for something or someone. The setting sun cast her elegant profile in gold, highlighting the hollows in her cheeks that hadn't been there 6 months ago. "The private investigator thinks we should increase the reward again," Philip continued, sitting beside his wife and taking her hand gently. "He says someone must know something." "We've already offered $5 million, Catherine said, her voice flat. "If that hasn't brought Sophia back to us, I don't think any amount will." The nursery door stood ajar down the hall. Neither of them had been able to close it since the night their daughter disappeared. Kidnapped by someone who had gained access to their building posing as a new nanny, taken their 3-day-old daughter and vanished. The ransom had been paid, $10 million in untraceable cryptocurrency, but Sophia had never been returned. "The FBI still thinks she's alive," Philip said, clinging to the one piece of hope they had left. "They would have told us if they'd found evidence to suggest otherwise." Catherine nodded mechanically. She'd heard these reassurances before. For 6 months they'd chased every lead, hired the best investigators, tested countless infants across the country. Their tech empire, once the center of their lives, now ran mostly without them as they focused all their energy on finding Sophia. "I had that dream again," Catherine whispered, "where I can hear her crying but I can't find her. I keep searching room after room but the crying never gets closer." Philip wrapped his arm around his wife's shoulders. There was nothing he could say that hadn't been said 100 times before. Their friends had stopped calling, unsure how to navigate their grief. Business associates sent perfunctory messages asking for updates, then quickly changed the subject when the answer was always the same: no news. "Let's get some rest," he finally said, helping Catherine to her feet. "The new FBI agent is coming tomorrow. Maybe she'll have fresh ideas." Back at the diner, Zora moved through the dinner shift with practiced efficiency. Regular customers asked about Hope, delighting in the photos Zora kept on her phone. Mr. Desai, who owned the electronics store down the block, slid an envelope across the counter with his payment. "A few of us took up a collection," he said quietly, "for Hope's future." Inside was $300, more money than Zora had ever received at once outside of her paycheck. Her eyes filled with tears. "I can't accept this," she whispered. Mr. Desai shook his head firmly. "It's not charity. It's community. You've shown us all what it means to step up when someone needs help. Now let us do the same." After her shift, Zora walked home through the crisp spring air, her mind whirling with plans. The scholarship application was due in a week. With Mrs. Chen's help, she could manage part-time classes. The community's support made possibilities seem within reach that had once been impossible dreams. She found Mrs. Chen and Hope both asleep in the rocking chair, the baby's tiny hand curled around the older woman's finger. The sight made Zora's heart swell. For someone who had grown up without a family, this sense of belonging, of mattering to other people, was entirely new. Carefully, she lifted Hope from Mrs. Chen's arms, kissing the baby's forehead as she settled her in the crib. Hope's eyes fluttered open briefly, a sleepy smile crossing her face before she drifted off again. "Sweet dreams, little one," Zora whispered. After walking Mrs. Chen to her apartment, Zora returned to find her phone blinking with a notification. Miss Powell had sent an email. "Need to discuss important development. Can you come to the office tomorrow at 10 a.m.? Zora's stomach twisted with anxiety. Important development could only mean one thing. They'd found Hope's family. The possibility she'd been both dreading and expecting from the start had finally arrived. She sank onto the edge of her bed, looking at Hope sleeping peacefully in her crib. For 3 months, they'd been a family of sorts. The thought of saying goodbye made it hard to breathe, but hadn't she always known this was temporary? Hadn't Ms. Powell reminded her repeatedly not to get too attached? Hope deserved her real family, people with resources and stability that Zora couldn't provide. Still, as she prepared for bed, Zora found herself memorizing every detail of their routine. The way Hope's eyes crinkled when she smiled, the specific bounce that soothed her when she was fussy, the soft coos she made while falling asleep, just in case these were their last days together. The next morning, Zora dressed Hope in her nicest outfit, a pale yellow dress donated by one of the diner regulars whose granddaughter had outgrown it. She packed the diaper bag meticulously, making sure to include Hope's favorite stuffed lamb. At the social services office, Ms. Powell greeted them with an uncharacteristically warm smile. "Thank you for coming in on short notice. Did you find her family?" Zora asked, unable to bear the suspense. "No, nothing like that," Ms. Powell said, gesturing for Zora to sit. "Actually, I have some unexpected good news. The diner owner, Wanda, is it? She called me yesterday." Zora nodded, confused. "She told me about the scholarship you're applying for," Ms. Powell continued, "and about the community support you've received. She was quite persuasive about your situation." "I don't understand," Zora said. Ms. Powell folded her hands on the desk. "We've decided to extend your fostering period for another 6 months, with the possibility of a more permanent arrangement if Hope's biological family isn't located." The words took a moment to sink in. "You mean she can stay with me?" "For now, yes. Your case will be reevaluated, of course, but given Hope's progress and your improved circumstances, I've recommended continuation." Ms. Powell's professional demeanor softened slightly. "It's quite remarkable what you've accomplished in these 3 months. Not many people could have done what you've done." Zora looked down at Hope, who was contentedly chewing on the ear of her stuffed lamb. Something that had been clenched tight inside her chest for months finally relaxed. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Don't thank me yet," Ms. Powell warned. "The road ahead won't be easy, but for what it's worth, I think you're on the right path." As Zora left the office, carrying hope in the spring sunshine, she allowed herself to imagine a future where they remained together, where education and opportunity and community support created a foundation strong enough to build a real life upon. For the first time since she'd aged out of foster care, Zora felt something unfamiliar but unmistakable: hope. The sound of coughing woke Zora from a deep sleep. Bleary-eyed, she checked the clock, 3:17 a.m., before rushing to Hope's crib. The baby's face was flushed, her breathing rapid and shallow. When Zora touched her forehead, heat radiated from her skin. "Oh no, sweetie," Zora whispered, trying to keep panic from her voice. "You're burning up." Hope coughed again, a harsh sound that seemed too big for her tiny body, then began to cry, not her usual demanding wail, but a weak, tamed whimper that frightened Zora more than any scream could have. Zora grabbed the digital thermometer Ms. Powell had given her. The reading made her heart race. 103.2 degrees and too high, she murmured, remembering the pamphlet about infant fevers. Anything over 102 degrees required immediate medical attention. Zora's hands trembled as she called Mrs. Chen, who answered on the first ring despite the hour. "Hope's sick. High fever. I need to take her to the hospital." "I come now," Mrs. Chen said without hesitation. "You get baby ready." Within minutes, Zora had packed a small bag with diapers, a change of clothes, and Hope's stuffed lamb. Mrs. Chen appeared at her door still in her nightgown, a heavy coat thrown over it. "My grandson will drive," she said, gesturing to the young man behind her. "No waiting for bus tonight." In the car, Zora cradled Hope against her chest, murmuring reassurances, though the baby seemed too miserable to hear them. The city streets were nearly empty, allowing them to reach Chicago Children's Hospital in record time. "I'll pray," Mrs. Chen said as they dropped Zora at the emergency entrance. "Call when you know something." The emergency room was brightly lit and surprisingly busy even at this hour. A triage nurse took one look at Hope and immediately ushered them into an examination room. "How long has she had the fever?" the nurse asked, efficiently checking Hope's vital signs. "I don't know. I woke up to her coughing. It might have started while we were both asleep." Guilt washed over Zora. What if Hope had been sick for hours while she slept through it? And she's 6 months old? "Almost 4 months, Zora corrected. She was abandoned as a newborn. I'm her foster mother." The nurse nodded without judgment, continuing her examination. "The doctor will be in shortly." The pediatrician who arrived minutes later was young, with dark circles under his eyes suggesting he was nearing the end of a long shift. "Dr. Lin," according to his name tag. "Looks like we've got a case of bronchiolitis," he said after examining Hope. "It's a common viral infection in babies, usually caused by RSV. Not dangerous for most infants, but the high fever is concerning." "What do we do?" Zora asked. "We'll run some tests to confirm, start her on fever reducers, and monitor her oxygen levels. She might need to stay overnight." The next few hours passed in a blur of blood draws, nebulizer treatments, and various staff members coming in and out of their room. Hope cried during the procedures, but calmed whenever she was back in Zora's arms. By morning, her fever had dropped to 109 degrees, and her breathing seemed easier. Dr. Lin returned with a young resident doctor in tow. "This is Dr. Rivera. He'll be taking over Hope's case for the day shift." Dr. Rivera smiled as he examined Hope's chart, then froze, his forehead creasing. "You said she was found abandoned at around 3 days old 4 months ago?" Zora nodded. "And no information about her birth parents?" "None," Zora confirmed, anxiety creeping into her voice. "Why, is something wrong with her tests?" Dr. Rivera hesitated, exchanging a glance with Dr. Lin. "No, her tests are fine. It's just, I recently completed a rotation at Lakeside Medical Center. There was a high-profile case there, a missing infant taken from her family. The timing and certain physical markers?" He paused, studying Hope more intently. "It's probably nothing, but would you mind if I consulted with a colleague?" Zora's heart began to race. "What physical markers?" "A small birthmark behind her left ear, for one. And she has a distinctive blood type, AB negative. It's quite rare." Zora gently turned Hope's head, revealing the tiny heart-shaped birthmark she'd noticed during their first bath together. Something cold settled in her stomach. Do whatever you need to do. After the doctors left, Zora sat holding Hope, trying to process what was happening. Could Hope actually be someone else's missing child? The thought had crossed her mind in those early days. Surely someone was looking for this perfect baby. But as weeks passed with no one coming forward, she'd allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, Hope had been meant to find her way to Zora. Dr. Rivera returned an hour later with a serious-looking woman in a business suit. Ms. Williams. This is Agent Patel from the FBI. The woman extended her hand. I'm investigating the kidnapping of Sophia Kingsley, an infant taken from her parents 6 months ago. Based on Dr. Rivera's observations, we have reason to believe that Hope may in fact be Sophia. Zora instinctively tightened her hold on Hope. That's not possible. I found her in a trash heap left to die. If these people cared about their baby, how did she end up there? Agent Patel's expression softened slightly. The kidnapper demanded ransom from the family. They paid it, but their daughter was never returned. We believe the kidnapper may have abandoned the baby after collecting the money. We can resolve this easily with a DNA test. Dr. Rivera added gently. The Kingsley family has provided samples for comparison. Zora looked down at Hope, now sleeping peacefully in her arms, oblivious to how her world, how both their worlds, might be about to change forever. And if she is their daughter? What happens then? Then she would be returned to her legal parents, Agent Patel said quietly. The words hit Zora like a physical blow. She knew she should feel relief that Hope might be reunited with a family who desperately wanted her. Instead, she felt only a crushing sense of loss. Can I stay with her until we know for sure? Agent Patel nodded. Of course. We'll expedite the DNA test results. It should only take a few hours. Those few hours were the longest of Zora's life. She called Mrs. Chen and Wanda, explaining the situation in a voice that threatened to break with every word. Both promised to come to the hospital, but Zora asked them to wait. She needed this time alone with Hope, memorizing every detail of the baby's face, the weight of her in Zora's arms, the particular way she sighed in her sleep. Hope's fever continued to drop, and by afternoon she was alert and babbling. Zora read to her from the single book she'd brought, fighting tears as Hope patted the colorful pages with her tiny hands. I love you so much, little one, Zora whispered, no matter what happens next. At 4 o'clock, Agent Patel returned with Dr. Rivera and a hospital administrator. Their faces told Zora everything before they spoke a word. The DNA test confirms it, Agent Patel said quietly. Hope is Sophia Kingsley. Even though she'd been preparing herself for this moment, the confirmation struck Zora with physical force. She closed her eyes briefly, pulling Hope, no, Sophia, closer to her chest. The Kingsley family has been notified, Agent Patel continued. They're on their way to the hospital now. How long do we have? Zora asked, her voice barely audible. They'll be here within the hour. I know this is difficult, Ms. Williams, but I want you to know that what you did, finding her, caring for her all these months, you saved this child's life. Zora nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Would you like some privacy until they arrive? The hospital administrator asked kindly. Please. Left alone, Zora sat in the rocking chair by the window, hope cradled against her heart. Did you hear that, little one? Your real family is coming for you. They've been looking for you all this time. Her voice broke. They're probably wonderful people who can give you everything I never could. A big house, the best schools, vacations to amazing places. Hope gazed up at her with those dark, serious eyes that always seemed to understand more than they should. I need you to know something important, Zora continued, tears falling freely now. Finding you was the best thing that ever happened to me. You made me believe in myself again. You helped me find a community, a future. I won't ever forget you. Not for one single day. The next 45 minutes passed in a blur of rocking, singing soft lullabies, and trying to commit to memory the weight of hope in her arms. When a gentle knock came at the door, Zora took a deep breath, wiped her eyes, and called, "Come in." Agent Patel entered, followed by a tall man in an expensive suit and a slender woman whose elegant appearance couldn't hide the signs of prolonged stress and grief. Philip and Catherine Kingsley looked exactly like the type of people who would live in a lakeside penthouse. Wealthy, sophisticated and completely out of place in Zora's world. For a moment, everyone stood frozen. Then Catherine Kingsley stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the baby in Zora's arms. A small sound escaped her, half gasp, half sob. "Sophia," she whispered, reaching out a trembling hand. Hope turned at the sound, studying the newcomers with curious eyes. She didn't cry or reach for them, but she didn't shrink away either. The tension in the room was unbearable. Zora knew what she had to do, even though every instinct screamed against it. Gently, she stood and stepped toward Catherine. "Would you like to hold her?" she asked softly. Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "May I?" With hands that shook slightly, Zora transferred Hope to her birth mother's arms. The baby looked startled for a moment, then reached up to touch Catherine's tear-streaked face with a tiny hand. Catherine sank into a chair, cradling Hope close, her body shaking with silent sobs. Philip knelt beside them, one arm around his wife, the other hand gently touching his daughter's curls. Zora backed away, feeling like an intruder in a moment she had no right to witness. Her arms felt horrifyingly empty. "I should go," she whispered to Agent Patel. "They need privacy." "Wait," Catherine said, looking up suddenly. "You're leaving?" "Just like that?" Zora nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "But you've been her mother for months," Catherine said. "She knows you, trusts you. She's your daughter," Zora managed. "She belongs with you." Catherine exchanged a glance with her husband, some unspoken communication passing between them. Then she turned back to Zora. "Agent Patel told us how you found her, how you gave her your only coat in the middle of winter, how you've cared for her all this time." "Anyone would have done the same," Zora said, though they all knew that wasn't true. "No," Philip said firmly, "they wouldn't have. Most people would have called the authorities and continued with their lives. You changed yours completely for a baby you didn't know." "We'd like to hear everything," Catherine said, "about these past 4 months. Her likes, dislikes, routines, if you're willing to share." Zora looked at Hope, Sophia, contentedly nestled in her birth mother's arms, and knew she couldn't just walk away, not like this. Not without making sure the transition would be as smooth as possible for the baby, who had become the center of her world. "She likes to be bounced when she's fussy," Zora said softly, "and there's a lullaby Mrs. Chen taught me that always helps her sleep." As Zora began to share the 100 small details that made up Hope's daily life, she saw something unexpected bloom in Catherine Kingsley's eyes. Not just gratitude, but a dawning respect. For 3 days, Zora visited the hospital while Hope, now officially Sophia, recovered from her illness. The Kingsleys never left their daughter's side, but they made space for Zora, watching intently as she demonstrated the specific bounce that soothed the baby, or the way she prepared formula at exactly the right temperature. On the day of Sophia's discharge, Zora arrived with a small gift bag containing the stuffed lamb the baby couldn't sleep without. She'd spent the previous night in her empty apartment, the silence deafening without Hope's soft breathing. Her plan was simple: hand over the lamb, say goodbye, and start the painful process of rebuilding her life without the child who had transformed it. But when she reached the hospital room, Catherine Kingsley greeted her with unexpected warmth. "We've been waiting for you," she said. "Philip and I would like to talk to you before we leave." Zora nodded, bracing herself for a polite but final farewell. Instead, Philip gestured to a chair beside Sophia's hospital crib. "We've been discussing our daughter's future," he began, "and yours is tied to it in ways we hadn't anticipated." Zora looked between them, uncertain. "I don't understand." "Sophia knows you," Catherine said simply. "She trusts you. You're the only mother she remembers." Her voice caught slightly on the word mother, but she continued with remarkable composure. "We can see how much you love her and how much she loves you." "What Catherine is trying to say," Philip added, "is that we don't want to cut you out of Sophia's life. That would be cruel to both of you." Zora's heart thumped painfully in her chest. "What are you suggesting?" The Kingsleys exchanged a glance before Catherine answered. "We'd like to offer you a position as Sophia's nanny. You would live in our guest house with full benefits including health insurance and paid time off. Most importantly, you'd help us transition Sophia into her new home and remain a constant presence in her life." Of all the scenarios Zora had imagined, this wasn't one of them. "You want me to work for you?" We want you to continue being important to our daughter, Philip clarified. We're not asking you to be just an employee. We're asking you to help us become a family, one that includes you. And, Catherine added, we understand you were recently accepted into a scholarship program at Chicago Community College. We'd like to ensure you can complete your education. Your position would work around your class schedule, and we'd cover any cost the scholarship doesn't. Zora struggled to process their offer. Part of her wanted to refuse, to make a clean break rather than watching someone else mother the child she loved. But the thought of never seeing Hope Sophia again was unbearable. Could I think about it? She finally asked. Of course, Catherine said, handing Zora a business card. This has our address and phone numbers. Take whatever time you need. When Zora stood to leave, Sophia reached out from her crib, babbling insistently. Without thinking, Zora leaned down and picked her up. The familiar weight in her arms brought tears to her eyes. I'll see you soon, little one, she whispered, pressing a kiss to Sophia's forehead before handing her to Catherine. Outside the hospital, Zora found Wanda waiting in her ancient station wagon. How'd it go? Wanda asked as Zora slid into the passenger seat. Zora recounted the Kingsleys' unexpected offer. I don't know what to do, she admitted. Would it be worse to see her every day knowing she's not mine or to never see her again? Wanda was quiet for a long moment, hands steady on the steering wheel. When my oldest boy died, his wife remarried a few years later. I had a choice. Stay in my grandchildren's lives and watch another woman help raise them or step back because it hurt too much. She glanced at Zora. I chose to stay. It was hard seeing someone else in the role I thought should have been my daughter-in-law's. But those kids needed their grandmother. And I needed them. The parallel wasn't exact, but Zora understood the message. Sometimes love meant accepting complicated arrangements, messy emotions, and imperfect solutions. After dropping Zora at her apartment, Wanda squeezed her hand. You'll figure it out. You're stronger than you know. That evening, Zora made 2 columns on a piece of paper, reasons to accept and reasons to decline. The decline column filled quickly. It would be painful, potentially confusing for Sophia, awkward with the Kingsleys. The accept column held just 1 line. I would still be in her life. In the end, that was the only reason that mattered. 3 days later, Zora stood in the sunny guest house behind the Kingsleys' lakefront mansion, surrounded by more space than she'd ever had to herself. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked a manicured garden. The kitchen gleamed with appliances she didn't know how to use. A desk in the corner held a new laptop with a note. For your classes. It felt like a dream, or someone else's life she'd accidentally stepped into. Philip showed her how to use the security system and gave her a set of keys, including one to the main house. We want you to feel comfortable coming and going between the houses. Sophia will be confused enough by the new surroundings. That first week was a delicate dance of establishing routines and boundaries. Zora showed Catherine how to prepare Sophia's bottles, which songs calmed her at bedtime, the early signs that she was getting tired or hungry. Catherine absorbed everything with intense focus, occasionally wiping away tears when a particular gesture or sound from Sophia overwhelmed her. 6 months, she whispered one evening as they sat together in the nursery. I missed 6 months of her life. First smile, first laugh. I'll never get that back. Zora hesitated, then reached for her phone. I took pictures, she said softly, almost every day. And videos. She handed Catherine the phone. I'd like you to have them. Catherine scrolled through the images with trembling hands. Sophia's first real smile. Her concentrated expression when she discovered her own feet. The way she had once fallen asleep with a spoonful of applesauce halfway to her mouth. Thank you, Catherine said, her voice breaking. For keeping her safe when we couldn't. For loving her when we couldn't be there. She looked up at Zora with tear-filled eyes. I used to be jealous of you. Now I'm just grateful. Gradually, they found their rhythm. Catherine and Philip were Sophia's parents, making all major decisions, but they valued Zora's input and experience. Zora started classes 3 mornings a week, returning to find Sophia eager to see her. The baby recognized all 3 of her caregivers now, distributing her affection with generous enthusiasm. 3 months into the arrangement, Philip approached Zora as she studied at her desk. Catherine and I have been discussing something, he said, taking a seat across from her. We'd like to make your position in Sophia's life more official. Zora set down her pen. What do you mean? We'd like to name you as Sophia's legal godmother. If anything were to happen to us, you would be her guardian." The magnitude of what they were offering, their trust, their daughter, a permanent place in their family, left Zora speechless. "You don't have to decide right away," Philip added. "It's a big responsibility." "No," Zora said quickly. "I mean, yes. Yes, I would be honored." On Sophia's first birthday, once a bitter reminder of her kidnapping, now a celebration of her return and the unique family that had formed around her, Zora stood beside the Kingsleys as they welcomed guests into their home. Mrs. Chen was there, along with Wanda and several regulars from the diner who had supported Zora during those early months with hope. Catherine had insisted on inviting them all. "They're the village that helped raise our daughter," she'd said. "They deserve to be part of her life too." As Sophia toddled between the guests, secure in the knowledge that she was surrounded by people who loved her, Zora found herself standing beside Catherine at the window. "I have something to show you," Catherine said, leading Zora down a hallway to Philip's office. On the wall hung a large professional photograph of Sophia, grinning widely at the camera. Beside it was a framed snapshot Zora recognized, one she'd taken herself on her old phone, showing Hope bundled in a secondhand sweater, laughing at something off camera. "We want her to know her whole story," Catherine explained. "How she was lost, then found again. How she's loved by more people than most children ever know." By Sophia's second birthday, Zora had completed her associate degree and enrolled in a bachelor's program in business administration. The Kingsleys had kept their promise to support her education, even creating a flexible work schedule that allowed her to take additional classes. That same year, Philip approached Zora with an unexpected proposition. "The Kingsley Foundation is launching a new initiative supporting youth aging out of foster care," he explained. "We'd like you to help design it and eventually direct it." Zora stared at him in shock. "Me? I don't have any experience running something like that." "But you have the most important qualification," Philip countered. "You lived it. You know what these young people need better than any consultant we could hire." The project gave Zora purpose beyond her role as Sophia's godmother. She threw herself into creating programs she wished had existed when she aged out. Housing assistance, mentorship, educational support, job training. The work was challenging but deeply fulfilling, allowing her to transform her own difficult experiences into hope for others. On the evening of Sophia's third birthday, after the guests had gone home and the little girl was tucked into bed, Zora found herself sitting on the terrace with Catherine and Philip. The night was warm, the lake a distant shimmer beyond the gardens. "Do you ever think about how unlikely all this is?" Catherine asked, gesturing vaguely at the three of them. A billionaire tech couple, a former foster kid from the South Side, and a baby who connected worlds that never should have crossed. "I think about it all the time," Zora admitted. 3 years ago, I would have walked past you on the street and never noticed you," Catherine continued, her honesty both startling and refreshing, "not because you're not worth noticing, but because our lives were so completely separate." "And now?" Zora asked. Catherine reached over and squeezed her hand. "Now I can't imagine our family without you. Sophia has 3 parents who would do anything for her. How many children are that lucky?" As they sat in comfortable silence, Zora thought about the scared teenager who had once found a baby in the trash, how she'd had no idea that single act of compassion would not only save a child's life, but transform her own. How sometimes family wasn't what you were born into or what you planned for, but what found you when you opened your heart wide enough to let it in. Through Sophia, 2 unlikely worlds had merged, proving that family transcends blood and wealth, formed instead through love, sacrifice, and the courage to care for others, even when you have almost nothing to give.